I'm an archaeological scientist, and one of the things that I hope to be able to do this evening is to try and explain to you what that involves and what that is. And I've chosen the Sevso silver because it is probably the most magnificent Roman silver ever to have been discovered, but it encompasses so many of the questions and problems that as an archaeological scientist we face. This group of silver lay buried for 1,500 years, and it was then found, we don't know where it was found, somewhere in the Roman Empire. Various countries have claimed it, and some of you may have followed in the press coverage. Lebanon, which is here, was the first country to lay claim. They filed a lawsuit in the New York Supreme Court and had an injunction on the silver when it first went on public display in 1990. And the ink had almost not dried from that claim than Croatia, Yugoslavia as it was then, and then became Croatia, also filed a claim, and that was based on the fact that it was Tito's army who had found the treasure off a remote island which had been used as a military base. And then shortly after that, Hungary, which is just about here, also filed a claim based on iconographic evidence from the silver itself, in fact. So Hungary's claim was based on this inscription, reading Pelso, which is the ancient name for Lake Balaton in Hungary. This is one of the dishes. We call this the hunting dish. And it's, in fact, given its name to the silver. This is, here we see this Latin inscription. Now, most Roman treasures that have ever been found have been named after their find spot, but as we have no idea where the Sevso silver was found, and we may never know, the inscription here in Latin, which reads, "Let these small vessels, Sevso, last you for many ages, so that they may be worthy of and benefit your ancestors." We think, in fact, this scene, which is a picnic scene, is probably Sevso himself, sitting here in front of, they're having a picnic, and it was an elk hunt. You can see the hunting scenes here with trapping the elks in the nets, and here a boar hunt. And here's the picnic, Mr. and Mrs. Sevso with 3 guests and being attended. We have ewers and amphoras in a basket. The name of the horse is also depicted. And the black around the silver is niello. That's a silver sulphide material used for inlays frequently in ancient silver. The outer border is decorated with, again, hunting and farming scenes. Here you can see an ox cart being guided by a figure here who's pulling the ox, one of the oxes, by his horns. Two other scenes, I mean, this may be, for example, it's the only building shown on the frieze, and it may, of course, be Sevso's villa. Here we have hunting animals, chasing one another. And this is all hand engraved, niello inlay, and gilding, mercury gilding. One of the most spectacular things, apart from the decorative detail of this treasure, is the sheer size of the objects. This is the heaviest object in the group, the Achilles plate, which weighs nearly 12 kilos. A geometric plate, one of the earliest, possibly the earliest. Kenneth Painter of the British Museum thinks that this is probably the earliest plate object in the group, with an intricate geometric pattern at its center. The Meleager plate, with the details of, mythological details of around the frieze, and 5 ewers. 3 of these of which are probably the largest ewers known in the Roman period. The objects were not only ostentatious and served as ceremonial and to display their wealth, but when we were examining them, it was very clear that many of them were covered in significant wear. This animal ewer, for example, here the decoration was very worn because as the ewer had been used, the hand would have been holding it, and you could see that the gilding and the engraved decoration was significantly weathered. Just to show you some details of the animals. And here is the lid. And you can see here these 2 figures which are very worn. I mean, the design, the chased detail has almost completely worn away, and that's because that was the catch plate. So as the ewer was used, this decoration was worn. Other objects have got numerous repairs. This is an amphora, which we think was probably used for keeping hot water, and that may account for its shape. I mean, that's not my idea, but it's an idea that has circulated. There's another object very similar to this in St. Petersburg in the museum, and that may account for the very thin neck here. But this object, elaborately decorated, but clearly used for significant periods because it's covered in these soldered repairs. You can see here. Just to complete and go through all the objects in the treasure, this is the pair of situlas, again with a mixture of domestic scenes which may represent the owners of the actual objects themselves, and a wash basin. At the time, this period, the Romans certainly were using, hand washing was something that took place in public. So they would have needed very elaborate vessels for hand washing purposes at dinner tables. A casket, again with possibly the owner depicted. And you can probably see here various objects which look very much like the actual casket itself being carried, and other buckets. This is a mixture with mythological bathing scenes. Here, presumably used for glass phials to keep the cosmetics in. And again, here, I don't know if you can really see, but soldered attachments would have been used to hang the casket. So to go back to the beginning of the story of Sevso. The objects first appeared in the 1980s when an English aristocrat, Marquis of Northampton, his art advisor, the chairman of Sotheby's, and his legal advisor thought that this would be an art investment. So that is really how how it was purchased. I first saw pictures of the silver in the early 1980s when I was working at the Getty Museum, and in fact it was offered to the Getty at that time. But that sale didn't go through, and then it was not until 1988 when I was asked by Sotheby's to go and undertake a routine examination for authenticity, and I wasn't told about what it was, I wasn't given any photographs, or any documentation, and I walked into a bank vault and was confronted by 50 kilos of silver. And the question, was it real? Now, with hindsight, that may seem like a very clear, of course it's real, you know, and for those of you who are somewhat familiar with the Sevso treasure, it's now been exhibited and published, but back at that time, its question of authenticity was as relevant as its question of provenance. And so just to put that into context, I wanted to talk about another silver object, which was called the Risley Park Lanx. And this was an object, again, a large silver platter, which appeared on the art market. Here, there's a picture. Oh, and I wanted to just then show you, I hope this will work.
The Lanx hadn't been seen since 1736 and was legendary amongst Roman experts. Now that it had been found, mysteriously reassembled, it would prove irresistible to the dealers and museums.
According to George.
Now, the problem that we find with that is that in actual fact, it wasn't real and that it was a fake. But it was a man walked into an antiquitist shop in central London with a suitcase, unpacked the suitcase, and brought out the silver dish. And it was based very clearly on this 18th century drawing by William Stukeley, which had been published by the Society of Antiquaries, and seemed, all the art historians were absolutely convinced that there was no question that it was real. So not only had they'd used the fragments which were here, but they had the plate, as we were faced with it, was 26 fragments of reassembled and soldered together of silver. This is to show you the original 18th century drawing and to show you the plate. So while the art historians were looking at this and marveling at the rediscovery of this plate, it was brought to me for scientific examination and authenticity, almost as a quick look at it for a condition report, because it was going to be presented to the acquisitions board of the British Museum. And I looked at it and I said, it's not real. You know, it's not Roman. It's not made. Roman plate is always hammered, and this was cast. It has no corrosion. Roman plate, any metal. I don't have them here, but we'll see them a little later on. Any metal, even silver, which looks completely shiny and uncorroded on the outside, will have corrosion within it. So within, at the boundaries of the crystals, within the metal, there will be corrosion. And by taking a sample smaller than the white at the end of your little finger, we can look at that. We can look at the structure of the metal at an atomic level and determine whether it is ancient or not. So I put my findings forward, and of course that was, nobody believe me, but then, in fact, the British Museum had its own laboratory. They have a big scientific laboratory, look at the silver, and their laboratory backed me up completely. But nonetheless, the museum still went and bought it, and we had analysed the composition of the silver, and one of the curious things was that it was all Roman silver, except one fragment, one plain, undecorated fragment, which was not Roman silver. So the British Museum decided that this was a plate made in the 18th century, when the drawing had first surfaced. They'd melted down, because the original Roman plate was so completely corroded, they had melted down the silver and made a mould of the original before they melted it down, and then reused the silver, but they wouldn't have had quite enough because of the corrosion, so they had made one piece that was in new silver. And in fact, that's completely wrong. In fact, it was these people who are now quite famous, called the Bolton Fakers, who made such sophisticated objects that they ended up in the Chicago. This was thought to be this object ended up in the Chicago Art Institute. This Egyptian object was bought by an English National Museum with money from the National Arts Collection Fund, into a significant, I think it was about £500,000 or something for the object, and in fact they were all made in the 80s. So that, to say, puts it little into perspective when I talk about the work we did to determine the authenticity of the Sevso, because there are objects like that around, and that's what I spend a lot of my time looking at, in fact. So Roman silver, this is then to go through the work we did on the Sevso, is always hammered, apart from the attachments, the cast handles and feet and things like that, which were alloyed with copper because it made them harder and more durable. Here you can see the hammer marks, all these the little variations in densities. Is an X-ray, just like you get X-rayed in hospital, and shows us how the objects were made. This is the Meliega plate that we were looking at earlier on, and you can see that his head, they couldn't get the metal thick enough, because when you're hammering it, you've got to raise it, essentially, from an ingot of silver. And sometimes, if you want the silver to be thicker, you need to add pieces. Here, for example, the edges around the rim of the Meliega plate is made by adding pieces of silver. So these techniques are very well documented, and when we look at objects, we like to see all of these techniques having been used. Here, for example, you can see the engraving, and you can actually see the individual chisel marks on objects. So we can tell how long it took before they had to resharpen their tool. Was it the same worker working on the object, or did they have several people working? Were they left-handed? Were they right-handed? So as we look at the objects under a microscope, they really tell us a story. This we can see here, just to tell you the niello. This is this silver sulphide inlay material. It's a very high magnification of the plate we were just looking at. This is just to give you an example of these samples I was telling you about, that we can look inside the silver. And this is a metal structure, and we can see the corrosion has penetrated. This is the uncorroded metal, this white color here, and the corrosion penetrates into the metal crystal. And you can't really fake it. This is looking at the surface of the object, a section through the surface, so that we can tell how the gilding was applied and make sure that it is actually ancient mercury gilding and not some modern electroplating. Again, this is just showing you here, you have the surface with a layer of gilding, and then you have the corrosion here, and then here you have the uncorroded metal. Again, just rather pretty picture of what corrosion looks like when we look at it under the microscope. And the other thing we look at is composition, because for the Romans, weight was very important. They used their silver as a means of offering significant gifts. For example, there are inscriptions which talk about, 20 kilos of silver, or the equivalent of 20 kilos of silver, being the weight appropriate for a future emperor, which puts into perspective the Sevso silver. If you think it's got 4 plates and they're 10 kilos each, that's already 40 kilos of silver. The plates often have a weight inscription on the underside. And of course, there's no point in being careful about your weight if you're not also absolutely fastidious about your composition. So the Romans centrally controlled their composition, and Roman silver is invariably 96 to 98% silver, apart from things like handles and cast attachments. But when we look at objects which have things like the handles and feet and things put onto them, often the weight that's inscribed on the objects themselves doesn't include those attachments. And plate was used as mobile money. I mean, that's so one of the things we did for the Sevso was, of course, analyze every single object to make sure that it did have the right composition, that there were no spurious trace elements of modern contaminants in it. And as I say, this doesn't always help us, because with the Risley Lanks that we were looking at, they actually bought Roman coins and melted them down. This is the inscription just here, which is was a dotted inscription. And that inscription was probably put on before the plate was actually, it's clearly a manufacturer's mark. Other marks are clearly when objects have been given to someone else and have changed hands, but this is one of an original manufacturing mark. This is what we call the geometric plate, and the underside of the plate, which again, several inscriptions. So weight inscriptions, the manufacturer's mark, the name of one of the owners. So having determined that the objects were all completely genuine, the next question was, were they really a group of objects? Were they really a treasure? Or were they just a clever way of dealers putting objects together and making them more saleable by having a treasure, a sort of marketing tool? So the objects stylistically range over from about 350. The hunting plate, for example, that we looked at first, can be pretty closely dated, because there's a parallel object which was found in Switzerland, and it was found with a coin hoard, and we've got the dates of the coins. So some of the objects from parallels can be pretty closely dated. So the objects probably range over more than 100 years of style. Now, there are 2 groups of objects within this group. I mean, these 3 objects clearly form a group themselves, and these 3 objects also clearly go together. This is the basin we were looking at earlier with 2 ewers, which were used as a table washing service. So one of the things that we did was take samples of incrustations from the objects. And even though the objects now look very clean, and you can see the silver surface, deep within the recesses of the objects, there will always be incrustations unless you've chemically cleaned an object. If you clean it mechanically, there'll always be some remains. And in fact, on these, the undersides of the objects almost invariably had quite significant incrustations and corrosion products. So we took samples from every object, and we determined that in fact none of the objects had been buried in the ground. And they all had the same type of incrustation, which was a calcium, like a calcium carbonate, indicative that they had been in a cave, possibly, or limestone cave or a limestone cellar, but they had never been, they had no soil at all. Then, having determined that the treasure we also were very fortunate in the fact that we had this cauldron. Now, when this first came into our laboratory, it didn't look anything like this, and it was just a piece of broken copper, and nobody was very interested in it. But our job, of course, was to study everything. So we looked at this cauldron very carefully, and what we found were these traces here. And now this is the edge. This is the plate where I said there was what we call the geometric plate, which was possibly the earliest plate in the group. And here you can see is the rim edge of this plate. And so looking at the corrosion patterns and the little traces of copper corrosion left on some of the silver objects, we were able to match them to the inside of the cauldron. And we could then determine exactly how they had been placed. So we had the Meleager plate at the bottom, followed by the geometric, the Achilles, and that had a very, very big steep foot ring. That's the one that I showed you at the beginning, which was one of the heaviest, very deep foot ring, which had caused this crack that you'd see in the hunting plate. We then continued looking at the surface and found textile fragments. Well, not exactly textile, but mineralized textile. So the copper corrosion products have gone into the textile fabric, and the textile fabric has disintegrated and fallen away and been the subject of biological activity, but leaving almost like a fossil of the textile. And by looking at the weave of the textile, we could tell that it was a linen, a coarse linen weaved, coarse linen textile, which had presumably been used to wrap the treasure. So the cauldron by now had really proved itself to be so important and provided so much information that we were allowed to, the money was found, and we were allowed to take it out of its box, which involved quite a lot of remedial work before it could be moved, and we turned it upside down. Here it is in the conservation laboratory, and found not only these patch repairs, there were something like 32 patch repairs on the object, showing that very clearly it had been used as a utilitarian object over a prolonged period of time, but all this dark deposit all over the base. And this was charcoal. And the charcoal was fresh. I mean, it didn't have other deposits on top. So it was literally as if it had been used in a fire and then almost immediately put into this limestone cave. And this is just to show you, I was in Burma a couple of years ago and found in a monastery these monks using a pot that was very similar here, the pot. You can see very similar to the cauldron for cooking over an open fire. And so what we were looking at was this charcoal, and probably almost all of you know that any living material can be dated to the time that it dies. The carbon which is in us exists as carbon-12 isotope and also another isotope, carbon-14, and while we're living there's an exchange of these two isotopes. But once we die, that exchange stops. And by measuring that, we can determine the age of which an organic material dies. So we were able to get a date from the underneath of the silver, which proved that it was 98% certainty. The date of the wood was between 140 of the Christian era and 480. So the wood obviously has some age, but unless they were using mature wood, that pretty much reflects the date of the wood that was used. So we then decided to measure, make a reconstruction, computer reconstruction, because again, a lot of people have said that we'd proved that all the objects did belong in the cauldron, but many people said, well, there are lots of other objects that are missing. I mean, there were other objects, or I've seen objects, or dealers would come with other objects. So we made this reconstruction, taking the measurements of every object accurately and placing them in the cauldron using the dents and the corrosion patterns on all the different objects to show that in actual fact there was no room for any other object. So from that point of view, I feel completely confident to say that this was the treasure. I mean, there were no other objects. There were no small objects. That's not to say that there weren't some other objects, but not in this cauldron. That this was really a complete treasure.